Kovac stood at the front lines, surrounded by chaos. The sky above was scorched with fire as energy blasts cut through the air. The sound of screams and explosions mixed with the relentless advance of the enemy. He had faced death before, but never like this. The enemy force was unlike anything he had encountered, brutal, overwhelming, relentless. Yet Kovac fought on, his body moving on instinct, his training pushing him to hold his ground. His species, known for their physical prowess and strategic mind, prided themselves on being the sharp edge of the Galactic Alliance. Kovac had always been the first to charge, the first to lead. His talons tore through enemy flesh, his blaster burned through armor. For a moment, it seemed like the tide of battle was turning, that his effort, his sacrifice, might be enough. But that moment was brief. A sudden, searing pain shot through his side, and his vision blurred. He looked down and saw blood, his own, dark and thick, pouring from a gaping wound. He staggered, his weapon falling from his grasp. The battle continued around him, but for Kovac, time seemed to slow. He dropped to one knee, gasping for breath. The enemy pressed forward, their forces endless, but he could barely raise a hand to defend himself. Then, through the haze of pain, he heard it, his squad leader's voice crackling through his calms. The order was clear: retreat. There was no hesitation in the voice, no second thoughts. Kovac, now immobilized, watched as his squad, his comrades, his brothers in arms, pulled back, leaving him in the dust. No one even looked his way. He tried to reach for them, but his strength was fading fast. He could see the backs of his comrades, their retreating forms growing smaller, disappearing into the distance. His vision blurred further as his consciousness wavered. They were leaving him. The realization hit harder than any wound ever could. His mind raced as he tried to process the reality of the situation. His people, his allies, were abandoning him without a second thought. The cold logic of his species, drilled into him since birth, echoed in his mind. One soldier's life meant nothing if it jeopardized the greater mission. Sacrifice was expected, and Kovac had always accepted that. But now, lying on the blood-soaked ground, his belief in that cold philosophy began to crack. He had fought so hard for the Alliance, believed in their cause, yet here he was, discarded like a broken weapon. As the battlefield continued to rage around him, Kovac's thoughts grew darker. His body was shutting down, and with it, his hope. No one was coming for him. His own squad had made that clear. His species valued efficiency and survival above all else. There was no room for sentiment or unnecessary risks. He had been left to die because, in the eyes of his people, he no longer had value. He lay there, helpless, watching the world dim around him. The enemy marched forward, but it was not death at their hands that Kovac feared. It was the sheer loneliness of his abandonment. The Alliance, which had always seemed so united in purpose, suddenly felt hollow. His life, his contributions, his sacrifices, all meaningless in the grand scheme of things. As the sounds of battle faded in his ears, Kovac was left with one crushing truth: he had never truly mattered to the Alliance. They had preached unity, but when it came down to it, they had left him behind without a second thought. The sense of betrayal gnawed at him as his vision went black. Sergeant Carter's squad crouched in the trench, watching the battle unfold in the distance. The orders had been clear: fall back, regroup, avoid unnecessary risks. But Carter wasn't one to follow orders blindly. He had led this squad through countless missions, always putting his people first. To him, the battlefield wasn't just about strategy or numbers. It was about the people beside him, those who fought, bled, and sometimes died together. His team knew this well. Corporal Diaz, the youngest of the group, looked up to Carter with a mixture of respect and awe. Diaz had been through some tough battles, but he'd never seen a leader like Carter, someone who cared as much about his squad's survival as he did about victory. Private Jensen, a grizzled veteran, had been with Carter the longest. He didn't say much, but his loyalty to the sergeant was unshakable. As the human squad prepared to move out, a transmission crackled through their comms. Carter heard the alien command, the retreat order from the Alliance forces. His eyes narrowed as the cold, calculated words echoed in his ear. The alien soldiers had just abandoned one of their own, left him to die without hesitation. The heartlessness of it hit him hard. "They're leaving him?" Diaz asked, disbelief in his voice. The kids still hadn't gotten used to the brutal pragmatism of their supposed allies. Jensen shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Figures. They don't care. They never do." Carter's jaw clenched. He could feel the frustration rising in his chest. Abandoning a soldier on the battlefield, whether alien or human, wasn't something he could ever accept. His squad watched him closely. They knew that look in his eyes, the look that said orders be damned. "No one gets left behind." "Not if I can help it," Carter growled. He looked to his squad, eyes burning with conviction. "We're going back for him." Diaz glanced at the battlefield. "But Sergeant, Command told us to fall back. They said it's too dangerous." Carter shot him a glare. "You think I care what Command says? That alien's still breathing. And as long as he is, we're going to get him out of there." Jensen nodded. "I'm in. If anyone can pull this off, it's us." The rest of the squad exchanged glances. They all knew the risks, but Carter's certainty was infectious. There wasn't a single one of them who would question his judgment. The plan was suicidal, but they weren't here for glory. They were here to do what was right. They gathered around Carter as he sketched a rough plan in the dirt. The area was crawling with enemy forces, and getting to Kovac wouldn't be easy. But that didn't matter. They'd faced worse before, and this time, they had a clear goal: rescue Kovac and get out alive. Each member of the squad offered their own input, refining the strategy. Diaz suggested using smoke grenades to cover their advance. Jensen would provide sniper support from the rear, taking out any threats that got too close. Carter would lead the charge, with Private Miller bringing up the rear to ensure no one got separated. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it didn't need to be. They'd make it work because they had no other choice. The tension was thick as the squad prepared to move out. Each soldier checked their gear one last time, eyes focused, muscles tensed. They knew this mission could very well be their last. But the thought of leaving someone to die, especially after hearing how easily the aliens had discarded one of their own, made them all more determined. Carter gave a final nod, his voice low but firm. "We go in fast, hit hard, and we don't stop until we've got him. Understand?" A chorus of quiet affirmations followed. The squad wasn't made up of heroes. They were just soldiers doing what needed to be done. But in this moment, they were more than just a team. They were a lifeline, a final hope for someone the rest of the galaxy had abandoned. With that, they moved out, each step calculated, every movement precise. There was no room for error, no room for hesitation. They were human, and to them, the value of life wasn't something you measured in tactical advantage or cost-benefit analysis. As they pushed forward, Carter's thoughts flickered to the alien soldier they were risking everything to save. He didn't know Kovac, didn't care if he was some high-ranking officer or just another grunt. What mattered was that he was alive, and as long as he was, Carter would not leave him to die. The others might have abandoned him, but humans? They were different. The moment Carter's team broke cover, the battlefield erupted in chaos. Enemy fire was everywhere, blasts tearing through the air, exploding debris raining down around them. They had to move fast, and they did. Each soldier knew their role, each step choreographed to the second. Diaz tossed smoke grenades ahead, a thick gray cloud spreading over the ground to hide their approach. Jensen took position, his sniper rifle steady as he picked off threats from the distance. The rest of the squad surged forward, Carter at the front, leading them straight into the heart of the carnage. There was no hesitation. No second-guessing. Carter's mind was fixed on one goal: get to Kovac. His body moved on instinct, dodging blasts and diving for cover as they pressed on. Behind him, the others followed suit, each of them playing their part to perfection. Miller had rigged explosives to distract the advancing enemy, the blast sending shockwaves through the battlefield. It bought them precious seconds. The closer they got to Kyrovac's position, the more intense the enemy fire became. They were drawing attention now, too much attention. But the humans didn't falter. Diaz kept laying down cover, pushing through the smoke and debris, his voice calm despite the danger. Almost there, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. They reached the spot where Kyrovac had fallen. Carter spotted him, barely conscious, lying in a pool of his own blood. The alien's breathing was shallow, his skin pale. For a moment, Carter worried they were too late, but Kyrovac's eyes fluttered open, and he groaned, weakly lifting his head. His expression was one of disbelief. Kyrovac blinked, confused. Why are you here?" His voice was faint, barely audible over the battle's roar. "They left me." Carter knelt beside him, not wasting time on words. He hooked his arms under Kyrovac, hauling him up as Miller and Diaz quickly fashioned a makeshift stretcher. Kyrovac winced, clearly in pain, but tried to push them away, his voice a strained rasp. "You shouldn't. It's pointless. I'm done." Carter shot him a hard look, his tone as steady as ever. "We don't leave anyone behind. Not even you." Kyrovac didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was too foggy, his body too weak to argue. He was trained to accept death when it came, taught that saving him would be a waste of resources. Yet here these humans were, defying all logic, risking their lives to save his. Something inside him shifted, a realization that cut through the haze. Humans didn't think like the others. They weren't like the others. The team worked quickly, strapping Kyrovac to the stretcher while Jensen kept picking off advancing enemies. The rescue had attracted attention, and the enemy wasn't letting up. They were closing in fast, surrounding the area, but the humans didn't panic. Carter barked out commands, every move precise. "We get him out now, or none of us make it." With Kyrovac secured, they began their retreat. It wasn't smooth. Enemy forces had already marked their position, and the blasts grew louder, more concentrated. They were running out of time. Diaz and Miller flanked the stretcher, firing back as they moved. Jensen covered their rear, his sniper rifle still ringing out, taking down anything that got too close. The smoke had cleared now, and visibility was a double-edged sword. They could see the enemy, but the enemy could see them too. A group of hostiles closed in from the left, cutting off their escape route. Carter's mind raced. They couldn't afford to slow down. They had to keep moving, keep pushing, or they'd be overrun. "Miller, frag out!" Carter ordered, his voice tight. Without a word, Miller hurled a grenade into the advancing group. The explosion rocked the ground, throwing the enemy into disarray. It bought them a few more precious seconds, but it wasn't enough to lose the pursuit. The enemy was relentless, pushing hard, determined to wipe them out. Carter didn't stop. His eyes locked on the horizon. "We're close," he called out, half to himself, half to his squad. They just needed to reach the extraction point. The chase grew fiercer with every step. Blasts zipped past their heads, exploding in the dirt around them, but the humans didn't falter. Carter felt the weight of Kyrovac on the stretcher, knew they were slowing down. His legs screamed with exhaustion, but he didn't let up. He couldn't. Not now. Not when they were this close. Kyrovac, drifting in and out of consciousness, caught glimpses of their faces, grim, determined, unshakable. He couldn't understand it. Why risk everything for him? He was an alien, a stranger. Yet every one of them fought like he was one of their own. The extraction point was in sight. A final push, and they'd be clear. But the enemy had one last surge left in them. A volley of fire rained down, cutting off their path. It was too much, too fast. Carter and his team were pinned down, trapped between the enemy and escape. But they didn't quit. They couldn't. Carter gritted his teeth, his voice a low growl. "Jensen, cover us! Diaz, Miller, move!" Jensen's shots rang out, precise and deadly. Diaz and Miller surged forward, dragging Kyrovac with them. Carter followed, firing as they went, forcing a path through the chaos. The enemy was close, too close, but the humans fought like they had something to prove. And in the end, they did. They reached the extraction point, battered and bruised, but alive. Carter collapsed beside Kovac, breathing hard. He glanced at the alien, who stared back at him with something between awe and disbelief. "We don't leave anyone behind," Carter muttered again, his words sinking in this time. For the first time, Kovac believed him. Back at the human base, the sterile hum of medical equipment filled the air as Kovac lay in recovery. His body was healing, though the deeper wounds, the ones within, still festered. The memory of his own kind leaving him behind echoed in his mind. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, one thought gnawed at him. No one from his squad had even looked back. They had judged his life expendable, a casualty of war, not worth the risk. But these humans, strangers, enemies just months ago, had defied orders, risked everything to save him. Why? Days passed, and as his strength returned, so did his curiosity. The humans moved around the base with a kind of relaxed camaraderie Kovac had never seen among his people. It was something deeper than shared duty, something more personal. He watched them joke with each other, share stories from their past, and help one another through the recovery process. Even those who had barely known each other before the mission now shared an undeniable bond. Carter checked on him regularly, offering few words but always a steady presence. Kovac, still grappling with his disbelief, could hardly look him in the eye. The question hung heavy between them, but Kovac hadn't yet found the courage to ask it. Why? Why risk so much for him? Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. As Kovac regained mobility, he found himself wandering the base, observing how the humans interacted. There was an easy sense of loyalty in their movements, something natural, instinctive. It contrasted sharply with the rigid, calculated discipline of his own people, where every action was measured, and every bond formed out of necessity, not choice. One evening, as Carter sat cleaning his gear, Kovac approached. He stood silently for a moment before speaking, his voice still rough from the injury. "Why did you come back for me?" Carter looked up, not surprised by the question. He wiped down the barrel of his rifle, then set it aside, meeting Kovac's gaze with that same calm intensity. "Because that's what we do." Kovac furrowed his brow. "But you had no reason to. I wasn't one of you. I was already considered lost." Carter leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "We don't need a reason to do the right thing. It's not about strategy or orders. It's about the person beside you. Doesn't matter who they are." The words hit Kovac harder than he'd expected. His entire life had been dictated by strategy. His people valued efficiency, progress, survival of the whole over the individual. Sacrifice was logical, almost mathematical. Yet these humans operated on a different wavelength, one that didn't calculate the worth of a life by its usefulness. Carter's response carried an honesty that Kovac had never encountered in his own culture. "But why risk your entire team for me? You could have died." Carter shrugged, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "I could die any day. We all could. But what matters is how we go out. I wasn't about to let you die alone out there. Not while I had something to say about it." Kovac was silent for a long moment, digesting the words. He realized then that these humans lived by a code that transcended orders, something intangible but incredibly powerful. It wasn't just bravery. It was a deep-rooted sense of loyalty, of shared fate. It was something his people had lost a long time ago, if they'd ever had it at all. Over the next few days, Kovac found himself talking more with the humans, absorbing their stories, their perspectives. They spoke of comrades they'd lost, not with bitterness, but with honor. They mourned the dead, yes, but they also celebrated the bonds forged in battle. In these moments, Kovac saw the truth. His people, for all their technological superiority and tactical brilliance, were hollow in comparison. As his recovery neared completion, Kovac came to a decision. His time with the humans had opened his eyes to a deeper understanding of what made a warrior strong. It wasn't just skill or strategy. It was the bond between soldiers, the unspoken promise that no one would be left behind. When the day came for him to leave, Kyrovac sought out Carter one last time. He found the sergeant at the edge of the base, overlooking the horizon where the next battle surely awaited. Carter turned as Kyrovac approached, giving him a nod. "I owe you my life," Kyrovac said, his voice steady now. "More than that, I owe you my understanding. I see now what makes your kind different." Carter raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Kyrovac continued, "I used to think strength came from strategy, from sacrifice for the greater good. But now I see, strength comes from the bonds between those who fight. You didn't just save me. You showed me what true loyalty means." Carter gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Loyalty's the easy part. The hard part is living up to it, every day." Kyrovac nodded, taking in the weight of the words. "I want to fight alongside you," he said, his voice firm. "Not just because I owe you, but because I believe in what you stand for. If you'll have me." Carter studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. "Welcome aboard." Kyrovac clasped his arm, feeling the weight of the gesture. It wasn't just a handshake, it was an acceptance, a bond. In that moment, Kyrovac understood that his path had changed. He was no longer just a soldier of the Alliance, discarded and expendable. He had found something far more valuable than his own survival. He had found a place where loyalty, honor, and sacrifice meant something real. As Kyrovac stood shoulder to shoulder with the humans, he knew he had become more than an ally. He was one of them now, a brother in arms, ready to face whatever battles lay ahead, not as a solitary warrior, but as part of something greater.